Atomic Heart is a fascinating and strange game. It takes inspiration from modern shooters like BioShock, Far Cry, and even Portal, and wears those influences proudly on its sleeve. I was immediately drawn into its wonderfully realized alternate universe full of weird Soviet robots. There's even a Kojima-esque sense of strangeness to much of Atomic Heart that gives it an overload of style. But then your character has to go and spoil it all by saying something stupid like, "Crispy critters?"
Crispy critters!
Oh, help me, Comrade Major! I'm falling!
Holy shit!
Goddamn you, jump!
Now, before I dive in further, there's some controversy surrounding this game that should be acknowledged. Questions have been raised about the ties developer Mundfish and some of the game's investors have to Russian money, and whether or not the game's potential financial success could at least partly go towards helping fund Russia's war in Ukraine. And with the release date landing on the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the game's pro-Soviet themes, that could be called a distasteful coincidence at best. However, none of this is clear-cut, and the issues are beyond the scope of a game review to investigate. We encourage you to look into these accusations and decide for yourself whether it affects your opinion of the game or your decision to buy it. But now, on with the review. Atomic Heart begins with a leisurely tour of its grand, robot-filled Soviet utopia, which of course turns out to be a murderous robot Soviet dystopia waiting to happen. It's a wonderful introduction sequence, reminiscent of both Half-Life's train ride into Black Mesa and BioShock Infinite's Columbia arrival scenes. It sets the mood and effectively builds this surreal world while letting the player soak in it. There's lots of opportunities to stop and talk to random characters, eavesdrop on conversations, and poke your nose into things. You're in the shoes of Sergei Nechayev, aka P3, an amnesia-ridden, because of course he is, but loyal lackey of this grand dystopia's mastermind, Dr. Sechenov. You've also been teamed up with a sentient talking glove called Charles, or Charles, who you'll be bantering with constantly throughout the game.
Mechanic glove. I've been here before.
And it's not long before you find yourself dropped into a robot uprising and left to figure out how it's all gone so wrong. While the world building and setting are fantastic, I quickly got the sense that something was perhaps a little lost in translation from the game's native Russian tongue. Or maybe just badly written. Take the weird dialogue and pacing in this cutscene, for example.
Damn.
Forceps! 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 Forceps!
I'm on it.
Get me them!
What's this doing here?
What took you so long?
You got a neuropolymer capsule.
We don't need one.
So what's your name, Doc?
Larissa, and you ask a lot of questions.
You know what? You're on your own. You got this.
Where are you going? It's useless. We don't have the equipment.
I've got the equipment. Great. Now we're getting
How
somewhere.
did you do that?
You ask a lot of questions. Get out!
P3 in particular has a penchant for dropping some really juvenile lines.
Choke on it and die, you fat turd. It's creation. I don't give two wet farts.
He soon left me pining for a silent protagonist.
Where's the shit-ass way out of here?
There's also a very macho vibe and some weirdly sexual stuff that I think is trying to be funny, but ends up feeling like a bit of a schoolboy fantasy come to life.
What a stud! I can't get enough of jokes. Let me try you to the bone, baby.
Also, P3 has the weirdest catchphrase.
Crispy critters.
I found him to be a pretty unlikable lead. He comes across as a total lackey for the party and his boss, and for the most part doesn't seem to have much independent thought. I mean, come on man, your boss is the guy that created the murderous robot horde you're fighting. Maybe he ain't so great. He's just not a character the plot made me relate to or root for. And in general, the game's cast of characters is a bit of a mess. Many are hastily introduced, then just go unseen for the majority of the game's 20+ hour campaign. Although shout out to Granny Xena, she did make me laugh.
Take that! Eat shit and die!
The The plot has its share of twists, but there wasn't anything that really surprised me or hit me with much emotional weight. But its general sense of mystery and weirdness did a decent enough job of pulling me through the experience from start to end. The game's developers did recommend playing the game in Russian with English subtitles, which might help with some of the pacing and tonal issues, but it won't change the writing. Thankfully though, I found Atomic Heart's world itself enthralling. It's a joy exploring the various facilities and science experiments gone wrong. There's a plethora of computers and audio logs to help flesh out the calamity if you want to dig into them. Although again, the writing tended to feel a bit bland and didn't add much to the world. However, I did enjoy the rather macabre way that some corpses can talk to you and tell you what happened to them.
I went to get some coffee, and it grabbed me by the neck and snapped it.
I also appreciated the twist on scavenging, where you simply hold a button to suck up all the junk in front of you, which is especially welcome because there's a lot of scavenging. The design of levels is quite spectacular at times, with some wonderful attention to some very weird detail. Also, I'd like to point out I played on PC with all the settings cranked to max, and it looked stunning and ran like butter. But I was sad to see that none of the heavily marketed ray tracing features were available. Yet, at least. I'm a total sucker for that kind of stuff, and was looking forward to seeing it in action. Atomic Heart is a bit of a hybrid between being an open world and linear shooter. For about the first 6 or so hours and throughout the game's main missions, it's pretty much just going through a single facility. But then you find yourself out in quite a large open world area that you're free to explore, and it's big enough that you'll even want to jump in a car to get around. The world itself, while it has its highlights and has a few spectacular vistas, does become a tad samey, with it mostly being filled with the same few small houses and buildings, scattered around with some derelict cars and trees. Within the open world, there are polygons or testing grounds, which are essentially mini dungeons that will net you useful upgrades for your weapons. These were great, often throwing out some more challenging puzzles and bosses to mix things up. But other than that, there's not much to do in the world, other than head to the next mission or just wander around and scavenge for supplies while fighting off robots. But other robots will soon come along and repair anything you've destroyed, so it does feel kind of futile, and made me just run past anything I could after a while. I will also say that I wasn't a fan of the climbing. There's quite a bit of it, and it's cumbersome and slow and boring. You also have a frustratingly small jump that can barely get over even tiny bits of the world. And also a frustratingly small step. I often found myself getting stuck on just little pieces of geometry. And I did even manage to get completely stuck in parts of the world several times. Of course, the main thing you'll be doing on your journey is fighting. And combat here is quite satisfying, but perhaps a touch shallower than I would have liked. There's a wide variety of deadly robots and even plant-based zombie humans to fight, all with their own unique attack patterns to deal with. The enemies are usually quite tough, but not too troublesome to dispatch on their own. It's the big groups that can soon overwhelm you if you're not playing smart. Thankfully, you've got a fair few options tucked away in your arsenal. You'll likely come to rely a lot on your trusty axe or melee weapon of choice, as ammo, while not super scarce, is still worth being frugal with. When you do opt for some shooting, the gunplay is satisfyingly punchy, with enemies reacting powerfully to hits and exploding into pieces on death. There's a fairly standard selection of firearms to work with, including a pistol, a shotgun, an AK of course, and a rocket launcher, which is called the Fat Boy. See, this game wears its influences on its sleeve. Guns can also be loaded with special elemental canisters to give them either a freeze, fire, or electric effect, which can be especially useful for exploiting tougher enemies' elemental weaknesses. You'll also get a range of energy-based weapons, like a zappy pistol, zappy machine gun, and a zappy railgun. These all technically have infinite ammo, it just takes a while for it to recharge. And almost all of your weapons can be upgraded substantially, provided you scavenged enough junk from the world to pay for the upgrades. You will have to juggle all of these in your limited inventory space, along with ammo and any other health packs and junk you find, so you will likely end up rolling with just a few of your favorites and stashing the rest in storage. You'll also need to make good use of the small selection of special powers available to you. These include a freeze spray, a polymer jet that can amplify elemental damage, a shield, and mass telekinesis, which lets you pick up groups of enemies. You can equip up to 2 of these at any time, and they're fun powers to wield. Freezing enemies midway through them charging into your face is particularly satisfying. as is hoisting up huge groups of enemies to slam them back into the ground. These abilities also have no mana or ammo to worry about, they just have a quick cooldown, so you're encouraged to use them constantly. These powers can all be upgraded too, and you can fully refund points from any of them, so you're free to try them all and not get locked down any one skill tree, which is nice and all, but I feel like it would have brought more variety to the combat for giving you constant access to all 4 powers, rather than forcing you to pick and choose or constantly swap. You do have a couple of other tricks up your sleeve too, one being a special electric shock move that can deal out some quick damage, and the other being a quick dodge move. In general, you aren't super mobile, so most of the combat involves standing your ground and dodging big highlighted attacks. It can certainly be tense and satisfying, though it can occasionally feel a bit clunky. Combat in smaller arenas did often lead to me getting trapped in a corner or on a small piece of the world. I did also try playing with controller and keyboard and mouse, but I found something about the constant lurching and somewhat floaty feel of the combat to give me a bit of motion sickness on controller, which I never usually get. Keyboard and mouse felt good though, but console players susceptible to motion sickness may struggle. The game also features a tiny bit of stealth, with you able to quickly take down enemies if you can sneak up on them. But I only ended up using that a handful of times, so outside of the odd takedown, you'll pretty much never be stealthing your way through an area. The small handful of major boss fights here were particular highlights for me. Not so much for any amazing combat design, but their animations and music choices made them exciting set-piece moments. I mean, it's hard not to get a bit pumped up when you hear Doom composer Mick Gordon start shredding as this giant ball thing starts going absolutely ballistic. My main feeling with the combat though is that after a while, it became a little repetitive, with me finding a pretty regular rhythm to most fights. Freeze guys, shoot guys, zap guys, repeat. The encounter design is solid enough to not make it ever become boring, mind you, but you'll probably start to wish for a bit more variety by the end. Personally, I thought the game felt ripe for some kind of hacking to make robots fight for you, or just something that allowed you to take a bit more control of the environment. My favourite parts of the combat in Bioshock was always hacking all the turrets in an area and luring enemies into my traps, but there's none of that here. Despite its issues, Atomic Heart is a game I enjoyed. While at times it perhaps feels a tad too obviously inspired by other games, and it can feel clunky, and the writing can be just bad, all its weirdness does ultimately bring a surreal charm to the experience. And it's hard not to credit how ambitious it is, even if it doesn't quite stick the landing. But the real star is its unique world and strange robots, which was supported by enough meaty combat, light puzzle solving, and RPG mechanics to keep me well entertained throughout the entire journey. As a debut game from the studio, Atomic Heart is an impressive start. Play.